Do you think that it would have been impossible for God to create that universe, that interesting universe in which atoms and nebulas and planets and humans ultimately form? It would have been impossible for him to do that with gravity being stronger.
Hey, what's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. Today we've got a heavyweight philosophical showdown that I could not wait to break down for you. Alex O'Connor, the Oxford philosopher and one of the sharpest young atheist voices out there right now, is sitting across from Dr. Francis Collins, the former director of the Human Genome Project and one of the most prominent Christian scientists alive. And what unfolds between these two is a surgical, high-level deconstruction of the fine-tuning argument that ends with a concession I genuinely did not see coming. Stick with me all the way through, because the payoff in the final few minutes is the kind of moment you're going to want to rewatch a few times just to catch everything. Also, do me a huge favor and drop a comment letting me know what city or country you're tuning in from. I love seeing where this community is coming from. It seriously makes my day every time I scroll through. All right, let's get right into it.
In other words, when God goes to create the universe, is he constrained in the sense that if he wants to create this thought-permitting universe, that everything has to be so finely balanced? In other words, I'm not sure why the meta conditions are set up so that everything is on such a knife edge. Maybe I can spell it out like this, right? So imagine, I have a friend who, Phil Halper, who made this documentary about the fine-tuning argument. And there was a really interesting response that made reference to the Gnostic Christian tradition. The Christian Gnostics believed in the sort of the material world being the product of an evil demiurge. It's like this God of the Old Testament is the evil creator of the material world, and Jesus represents the true God, who is, spiritually pure and above all. And he was like, well, doesn't the fine-tuning argument kind of fit in better with this kind of picture of the universe? Why? Because the spiritual creator who realizes that the material world is evil and terrible doesn't want the material world to come about. And so he makes it so that it is near on impossible for a material universe like this to exist. And yet the evil demiurge wants to create that universe. And so he comes in and he perfectly tunes everything. So although it's completely improbable, he just makes it right that the material world can be created. But I think that this kind of slightly contrived image can help to demonstrate is that the very fact that it is so difficult to bring about the material world, but by finely tuning these constraints, is itself a sort of a backfiring against the existence of a creator God who wants there to be a universe like this and has the power to do it in any way which he pleases. For example, another analogy from the same documentary, if you were to have like a bag of balls, and you were pulling out a ball, and you were trying to figure out what the favorite color of the creator of the bag was, and you reach in and you pull out a purple ball, that might be confirming evidence that the creator of the game likes the color purple. But if you then tipped out every other ball and looked at every single other one except for the one that you picked was yellow, you might actually think to yourself, oh, okay, the creator of this game clearly prefers yellow, but I just happen to have picked the blue one. Now, obviously, that analogy doesn't work because that revolves around chance. But the point specifically being that if the conditions are set up so that there are an almost infinite number of ways that things could have been where none of this could have happened, and only one very precise way that it could have happened, the person who sets up that meta condition, what are we to make of their view of the universe? You see what I'm saying?
I think I see where you're going. And I don't think there's just one way where you could set the constants and the equations to end up with something interesting. This happens to be a really well-studied one that we happen to live in the middle of. Again, going back to Martin Rees's book, Just Six Constants, or whatever, it's close to that. He would argue that these constants are related to each other, so they don't have to have the precise values they do now, as long as their ratios are correct. So the six dimensionless constants that he outlines, including the cosmological constant. And if those are off by just a little bit, things don't work. But there's lots of solutions within that. So I think more of God as an artist. And of course, an artist can paint a lot of things that are really not very interesting, and then occasionally a masterpiece, but not usually just one masterpiece. So God has the opportunity to decide which of the masterpieces are going to be considered worth doing because they're interesting, and you live in one of those. I'm not saying it's the only one that could have been, it's just the one that we have, and it fits the description of what would need to be a very precise thought process to end up with something that would be more than just sterile particles.
Well, you keep using the word interesting, and it really makes me think of, I mean, the thing that sticks out about this whole thing is how unlikely it is that life would exist. And so it almost makes me think of even, in America, if there's an underdog sports team that wins, that is so incredibly unlikely that they would win, it sticks out to humans as something that's remarkable. And you keep talking about interesting and beautiful. Is that kind of really what you're getting at? Is that God made it interesting and that sticks out to us because of how unlikely it is?
Because it's unlikely and because it has complexity. I guess that's when I'm saying interesting. I don't think small particles flying apart forever is very interesting. I think something where you have a coalescence of stars and planets and chemistry that gives rise to amazing constructs, that's really interesting. And especially if it gives rise to something that allows through an evolutionary process the development of creatures with big, complicated brains that can have a conversation like this and can even feel some draw upon them somehow to reach back out to God, who we're not sure is there, but certainly feels like we're called to. That's interesting.
Okay, so right off the bat, Alex does something brilliant here, and I need you to understand why this is brilliant before we even get into the meat of it. He takes the fine-tuning argument, which is basically the theist's favorite weapon, the one they love pulling out, and he just flips it completely upside down. He brings up this Gnostic Christian tradition where Alex said this God of the Old Testament is the evil creator of the material world. And the reason he's bringing this up is not because he believes it. He's using it as a philosophical mirror. Here's what people don't realize. The fine-tuning argument basically says, hey, the universe is so improbable, so precisely balanced, that only a good creator could have done it. But Alex points out something devastating. He says this: the very fact that it is so difficult to bring about the material world by finely tuning these constraints is itself sort of a backfiring against the existence of a creator God. Think about what he's actually saying here. If you have an all-powerful God who wants a material universe to exist, why on earth would he set it up so that it's nearly impossible to create one? That's like a chef making a recipe that only works if every single ingredient is measured to the atomic level. That doesn't sound like omnipotence. That sounds like someone working against massive resistance. And then Collins gives this response that, honestly, I find kind of weak. He pivots to the artist analogy. Francis said this: God is an artist, and of course an artist can paint a lot of things that are really not very interesting, and then occasionally a masterpiece. And he continues by saying this: God has the opportunity to decide which of the masterpieces are going to be considered worth doing because they're interesting. You see the problem with that? He's basically saying God chose this universe out of many possibilities. But that doesn't answer Alex's question at all. The question isn't whether God picked this one. The question is, why are the meta conditions set up in such a knife-edge way in the first place? Who set the rules of the game? If God is truly omnipotent, he made the rules and the game. This is the part that blows my mind about so many theist arguments. They answer a question that wasn't asked.
Yeah. But to be clear, I mean, do you think that it would have been impossible for God to create that universe, that interesting universe in which atoms and nebulas and planets and humans ultimately form? It would have been impossible for him to do that with gravity being stronger.
I think it would not have been impossible. I don't think God chose to spend the energy of creation on something boring, at least just judging by what's around us.
But I mean to create the same universe. So not a boring universe. It's still an interesting universe. Everything is the same. We're still acting as we're acting now. It's just that gravity is stronger.
I think if that had happened, we would have had a big crunch before there was time for the complexity of chemistry to form in the heart of those stars, and it would have been not very.
So it would have been impossible for God to create that universe and there not be a big crunch.
I think if the only thing that was altered was gravity, everything else kept the same, the theoreticians would say, yeah, we had had a collapse of the universe before now. We would not have made it to 13.8 billion years.
So that means then that provided God wants to create this interesting universe as it is today, God is constrained in doing so.
He chooses
by the conditions of gravity. Yeah, but so once he's made that choice that he wants this universe,
he wants an interesting.
He can't make that interesting universe but by this very specific value of the constant of gravity. And so that acts as a constraint on God's creative power because God wants to create this beautiful thing. It's kind of like saying, you know, if God wanted to create the Mona Lisa without using like a paintbrush, like traditionally, I think theists would want to say, well, he could do that. He could just pop it into existence. There are ways of God to sort of get around our physical constraints. And if I said, well, no, I think that God chose to use a paintbrush because otherwise the Mona Lisa couldn't have been created and that would have been uninteresting. But the question I'm asking is, could he have made the Mona Lisa without the paintbrush? Could he have created the world as interesting as it is today with a stronger force of gravity? You know what I mean? Like, I understand what you're saying, that he wouldn't choose to have a gravity that has a universe that has a big crunch because it wouldn't lead to life. That would be so uninteresting. But what I'm saying is, why couldn't there be a stronger constant of gravity that in our current model would lead to a big crunch? But because God is God, he can create that universe nonetheless and avoid a big crunch somehow. Or is he constrained by the constant of gravity and what he can create?
I think
this is where Alex absolutely traps him. And I want you to pay close attention because what happens over these 4 minutes is one of the cleanest philosophical setups I have seen in a long time. Alex asks a very simple question. He asks this: do you think that it would have been impossible for God to create that universe, that interesting universe in which atoms and nebulas and planets and humans ultimately form? It would have been impossible for him to do that with gravity being stronger. Simple question, yes or no. And Collins walks right into the trap. He responds by saying this: I think it would not have been impossible. I don't think God chose to spend the energy of creation on something boring. Wait, hold on. Do you hear what just happened? He said it would not have been impossible. But then he immediately has to walk it back because Alex presses him. What if the only thing you change is gravity? Everything else stays the same. And now Collins has to admit the universe would have collapsed in a big crunch. So suddenly it is impossible. And here comes the knockout setup. Alex says this: that acts as a constraint on God's creative power. Let that sink in. A constraint on an omnipotent being. And then Alex delivers the line that I genuinely believe is going to be quoted for years in philosophy circles. He says this: it's kind of like saying if God wanted to create the Mona Lisa without using like a paintbrush. You have to understand how devastating this analogy is. A true omnipotent God doesn't need a paintbrush. He doesn't need gravity to be exactly 6.67 4 times 10 to the negative 11. He just speaks it into existence. That's what omnipotence means. The moment you say God had to use specific tools, specific constants, specific physical laws to achieve his creation, you are no longer describing the traditional God of classical theism. You are describing something more like a cosmic engineer working within constraints. A powerful being, sure, but not the uncaused, unlimited being that Christianity claims. And Collins doesn't have an answer for this.
I think I see where you're going. I think God is a God of order. And that meant that in any universe, God would choose to have matter and energy follow orderly laws.
Mm-hmm.
We happen to have a set of those. They might have been otherwise, We haven't talked about whether you could come up with a completely different universe where gravity was an inverse cube instead of an inverse square.
Mhm.
That sort of makes my head hurt. But within the nature of the laws that seem in this universe to govern matter and energy, if God is a God who's interested in something complex, and let's come back to my faith here, God is also a God of love. God wants to have creatures that God can have relationship with, and that is going to guide the decision-making then about what kind of universe will achieve that goal. I don't think it's constrained by the fact that God wants to love his creatures. That's who he is. And if that's the case, I don't know that it's constraining him in terms of physics to choose the right parameters to make that happen. It's a means to the end. The end is what mattered.
But he couldn't have got that same outcome through different parameters. That's the constraint that I'm talking about.
Unless you change the laws also, and I don't know how you would do that. If you're going to stick with the laws we've got
Mhm.
and just change one constant, gravity, and expect that to end up with complexity, it won't work.
Even for God. Even God couldn't make that happen.
You know, this sort of feels like, well, God could decide 2 + 2 can be 5. And that
Right. So but that's what I'm asking is are these fundamental constants something like, laws of logic, like 2 and 2 is 5, in which case, because if I ask a believer in God, do you think that God is constrained by the laws of logic? Oftentimes they say, in a sense, yes, but that's not really a problem because these are just the laws of logic. What I'm asking is, are things like the strong and weak nuclear force and the strength of gravity like the laws of logic, and that they plausibly constrain God in the way that the laws of logic might? That seems to me a really unusual thing. Like when someone says God couldn't make 2 + 2 = 5, I don't see that as a challenge to his omnipotence, because it's logically impossible. That kind of thing, like a four-sided triangle, he can't create that because it literally has no referent. It's not a thing. God can do all things. Four-sided triangles just aren't things. And so I totally understand that. But if it's, well, God couldn't create a life-permitting universe in which everything was the same except for gravity being 2 times as strong, he couldn't have done that. Well, I do see that as a challenge to his omnipotence, because that doesn't seem like a logical contradiction in the same way. It seems like a physical contradiction, but not a logical one.
I guess the other factor here that we haven't said explicitly is that God apparently is interested in nature following order. And the fact that there are those equations governing matter and energy, they didn't have to be there. But if you'll take as a given that God is interested in order of nature, and also that God is interested in having relationship with complicated creatures like us, then I think the only means to that end is to have that gravity constant in our universe be what it is. And so, yeah, I guess you could say there's a constraint there because otherwise God's goals are not achieved.
And here it comes, the concession. The moment where decades of careful theological framing just collapses in real time. Watch what Collins does. He retreats, he pivots, he says this: I think God is a God of order. Okay, great, but that's not answering the question. That's a vibe, not a logical response. Then we get to the moment, the actual moment. Collins says this: it won't work. And Alex finishes his sentence for him. Alex says this: even for God, even God couldn't make that happen. And Collins just lets it stand. He doesn't push back. He doesn't say, hold on, that's not what I meant. He accepts it. Do you understand what just happened? A Nobel-level scientist, one of the most respected Christian apologists alive, just agreed on camera that there is something God cannot do. And Alex, being the sharp thinker that he is, immediately draws the line between logical impossibilities and physical impossibilities. He says this: I do see that as a challenge to his omnipotence, because that doesn't seem like logical contradiction, and he's 100% right. There is a massive difference between God cannot make a square circle, which is a logical contradiction with no meaning, and God cannot make gravity stronger, which is a physical limitation. One doesn't challenge omnipotence, the other absolutely does. And here's what history teaches us. This exact tension has been recognized by theologians going all the way back to Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century. Aquinas tried to solve it by saying, God can do anything logically possible. But he also maintained God is not bound by physical laws because God created them. Collins has just contradicted that entire tradition. He has essentially said God is bound by the physics he created. That's a huge theological problem. And then the final nail, Collins says this. Yeah, I guess you could say there's a constraint there because otherwise God's goals are not achieved. There it is, the word constraint, on God, from a Christian apologist. This is what a clean philosophical concession looks like. Alex didn't yell, didn't interrupt, didn't grandstand. He just asked simple surgical questions until the contradiction emerged on its own. That's how you win a debate. So, what do you guys think of this? Leave your thoughts down in the comments. Please like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.